That's number 15, of course. And a little bio on Rachel Carson after a quote from her. Let's see. The more clearly we focus our attention on the wonders and realities of the universe around us, the less taste we shall have for destruction. So if you wonder why Rachel Carson is more than just a milestone thinker for her fight against pesticides, which she calls biocides, this is a great example of that. Internet connection is down. Well, that's really interesting. Okay, we'll see how that plays out today. Rachel Carson argues that you have to care about nature first if you're going to want to seek its preservation. That's why she leverages the things that have been taught to us that we've internalized by people like Wordsworth and Thoreau, that we should care for the natural world, we should value it, maybe even that we should see it as kind of like a temple, which Shelley argued. Why? Because the more we care about it, the less we will want it to be harmed, the less taste we will have for its destruction. So if you want to see a connection between Thoreau and Rachel Carson, I think that's it. Although we're going to see how she's a little different than from Thoreau. We've already seen that to some extent. Okay, so a little bit more about the background of Rachel Carson. So Silent Spring was published in 1962. She died 2 years later of cancer. We don't know what caused it. It was not from pesticides, we presume. But yeah. So to be very clear, Rachel Carson is principally a journalist. She did have a background, however, in biology. She had an MA in zoology from Johns Hopkins in 1932, which would have been exceptionally rare. Other institutions like Princeton didn't give the first PhD out to a female-identified person until the 1960s. So for her to have gotten in a STEM field a degree in 1932 was rather extraordinary. But then she made her living as a writer. She worked for the Bureau of Fisheries, the U.S. Organization, and they produced pamphlets and aimed at the general public. If they wanted to communicate something, they needed a good writer to do it. She did it. And then kind of in her spare time, she wrote 3 award-winning books. The last was called The Sea Around Us. It won all sorts of awards, and she was well-known nationally. And people were just, if people wanted to sit down and read about the oceans and what was happening there, Rachel Carson was kind of a go-to name, which set her up for sort of fame before she even published Silent Spring. So here you go, final exam question. Let's take a poll. Select. So who was England's first professional woman writer by way of patronage? And this is something that I mentioned in lecture. And I give this example because not only do you have to watch the documentaries, not only do you have to do the reading, not only do you have to watch the 2 little YouTube videos I do every week, one on the documentary, the YouTube videos I do every week on the documentary, you also have to come to lecture and be familiar with the lecture material. So let's see. Yes. People are realizing their mistake as A is creeping up. It is indeed Amelia Lanier. I threw in Catherine Phillips because we had her as well. I'm so glad that so many people now, it doesn't matter if you got it wrong here, it doesn't change anything. But what this suggests is you should go over the lecture material. Presumably you have notes, go over the notes, but also remember that the lectures are all uploaded to YouTube and to GauchoCast, and both of those gives you the access to review the actual lecture that I'm giving now. So what's showing up here, this real-time closed captioning, will turn into a transcript. But I'll tell you, if you don't have time to read everything there, the thing to do is go over the actual lecture notes. Either go through the Prezi or go through the PDFs. And presumably you've printed out the PDFs or you've uploaded them into an app that you're commenting on. But that's the main thing. And if you had reviewed the PDFs for this, beforehand, you would have known that it says in the PDFs that Amelia Lanier was the first professional woman writer. And everyone should remember Amelia Lanier. Anyhow, another extraordinary woman, Rachel Carson. Her lack of a PhD and the fact that she was a woman haunted her career. And also when she becomes attacked for Silent Spring by the chemical industry producing DDT, this is going to be a primary focus for her. So what do they want to do? They want to discredit Silent Spring. Why? Because it attacks the chemical industry. As so often happens, they focus on an individual and make it personal. And in Carson's case, they attacked her by saying, well, you know, she has an an MS in biology, but, you know, she doesn't have a PhD. She's not a research scientist. And then just, you know, her credibility as a woman immediately gets questioned, and even her sexuality. So what do I mean by that? And they were vicious in this. So Rachel Carson never got married. So what does that suggest? Well, she's probably lesbian. And they came out and said that. And they came out and it just, you know, again, instead of talking about the facts, instead of talking about the chemical, biocides, they talk about the person delivering the message. They attack the messenger. And it was absolutely vicious, the attack on her. And I'll give you some examples, an example here. And this continues today. Rachel Carson is still attacked today. So 2002, 20 years ago, chemical industry spokesman said, if man were to, by the way, if man were to, rather than if human beings were to, follow the teachings of Miss Carson, we would return to the Dark Ages and the insects and diseases and vermin would once again inherit the earth. The rhetoric here is just obvious and offensive. So, right, Miss Carson, you know, one word there, Miss, rather than if they just had said, if teachings of Carson, of Rachel Carson, but Miss Carson, one, that she's a woman, two, she doesn't have a PhD, it's not Dr. Carson, and three, not Ms., if you weren't sure if she's married or not, but Ms. And this example actually is a pretty mild one compared to what was done at the time. So it was pretty tough on Rachel Carson actually, and looking back on it. And we're going to end with Carson by seeing that this attack continues today with her own to her background. So Silent Spring. Published in 1962, so almost 60 years old now. More than anything else, I think, this publication of this book brought about the modern environmental movement. So we talked about Thoreau beginning like an environmental movement 100 years before the publication of Walden. Yeah, it was small and it was different from what Thoreau does, but this was a really big deal when it was published. It was published everywhere. So not only did the book get published, it was published serially, chapter by chapter, in places like the New Yorker, and there's something called the Book of the Month Club where it was published. I'll go over this. And it just got out to a lot of people. And if you go online and look anywhere, you know, what began the modern environmental movement, 2 or 3 things will probably be mentioned. I guarantee one of them will be the publication of Silent Spring. And often, a little local trivia here, often too, 7 years later, the Santa Barbara oil spill of 1969, which drew national attention, worldwide attention. And that, together with what else happened in the 1960s, laws such as the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Solid Waste Disposal Act, led to, in the beginning of the 1970s, the formation of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. And arguably, it wouldn't have happened the way it did as quickly as it did without Rachel Carson. It's a paradigm shift that she really brings about here, and it's pretty extraordinary. So, you know, sure, poets have been skeptical of science for centuries, but generally speaking, I think it's safe to say that prior to Silent Spring, the public was sort of all about all the wonderful things of modernity, these amazing new chemicals, amazing new things, how it was, making life better. And people just were all about, this brave new world that we were on board. But Carson shows the disastrous underside of that kind of acceptance. So in other words, if you let someone out there be in charge of spreading pesticides, and if it's the chemical industry, they're going to spread it all over the United States, and it could have disastrous consequences if there's no one looking out for you. And that's why the EPA gets formed, the Environmental Protection Agency, because it's looking out not just for the environment or life on it in the sense of birds and plants and all that, but for human beings as well. I mean, you don't want to live downstream of the factory producing this stuff and not have safeguards protecting you. So Carson focuses on one thing in particular, and we'll talk about that, which is what the industry called pesticides, what she calls biocides. But because of her work, often what happened was a whole range of different people in a whole range of different ways started looking at other so-called advancements of modern culture. So one would be the nuclear power industry. And in the 1970s, you may know, widespread protests, especially after the Vietnam War ended and those protests died down. Those sort of grassroots protests happened with the nuclear power industry, especially after 3 Mile Island in the late 70s. And it's really Carson who gets that kind of attitude going. Before that, people were like pro-nukes. They thought it was great, it was going to be wonderful, and they just weren't thinking of the problems. Similarly, there was no organization in the U.S. to look over chemical additives in foods and all. People didn't know what was in foods. And, we take for granted today, you can pick up a label of food and you can see what's in it. No one knew what was in food. It wasn't required. There was no organization to do it. And chemicals were routinely being put into food and people had no knowledge of what they were. They had no knowledge of anything. The famous example of a peanut butter company came on the scene in the 1950s, and everyone loved their peanut butter more. No one could figure out why until the government actually went to the factory and discovered that a third of the peanut butter was actually sugar. And they were using sugar mixed in with the peanuts to make it sweeter and better, and everyone loved it, and no one knew what they were doing. And because of Rachel Carson, I think people became more and more concerned for some sort of transparency as to what was happening with things of that sort. But to be very clear, it's not to say that Carson doubts the validity of science or even of, chemicals used in our modern world. But she's very skeptical of the claims that are just made by the people selling you that stuff. So the people selling you that peanut butter, the people selling DDT. Carson's argument is, okay, fine, let's look into that. Let's see what it is. Let's do, testing on it, independent testing. Let's have that testing juried, and let's see, what is for the best interest of the public, and maybe it's good. So an example would be, I'm pretty confident that Rachel Carson would be all on. In fact, I know this because it was happening in her era. Rachel Carson was all on board for immunizations, for example. Why? Because testing was done. It was found out that it did far more good than harm. And something like polio vaccine came on the scene, and she certainly would have endorsed that. So it's not just like a blanket problem with something like that. So Carson is communicator, and this is the primary thing that Carson does. Again, she's not a research scientist. She's all about communication. And the real skill here, and this is what makes her so well positioned to do it. First, she's had decades of experience in writing for the public and writing those 3 award-winning books and all. That's great. But she also has that master's degree in zoology, which is training in science. So she doesn't do the research herself, but she is fully capable of looking through the research, of reading, studies that are being done, kind of obscure, arcane studies, a lot of jargon, but she is able to take that, read it, understand it, but then, and this is the trick as her as communicator, put that out in simple, understandable terms to the general public. And even better than that, not only can she explain it, and this is the remarkable skill, she can put it down in a book that's so interesting that you'll want to just read from page to page and read the thing through and then, get to the end. That's pretty remarkable. And it was, I would argue talents like that are what's needed today. And you can see some of the major environmentalists today, people like Bill McKibben, Elizabeth Kolbert, and others are in this mode. So both of those people, by the way, were at first journalists for the New Yorker. So to be very clear, though, she doesn't do her own research. She disseminates the work of others, and she interprets it, understands it, and communicates it really effectively. So someone like Bill McKibben is the go-to example for that. Bill McKibben is the first person actually to write a book about the climate crisis in 1988. And he's very effective at what he did is the same thing Carson did, not focusing on chemicals used for pesticides, but rather he focused on the climate crisis. There was a lot of stuff out there. It was kind of confusing. He explained it in a simple way. He had a best-selling book at the time called The End of Nature. Background, again, he's a New Yorker journalist. He's not a scientist, but he's really effective at communicating environmental issues. And if you see here, another, maybe one of the go-to examples of a environmentalist in the 21st would be Al Gore. You may know him as a politician, but he's also an incredibly effective communicator. He produces that film, or the film about him is produced, so An Inconvenient Truth, and then the one that was an alternate film for Week One, An Inconvenient Sequel. Why? Because he's just a really good communicator. And it's the case that, scientists are not trained in communication, and they're often very busy in the research that they do. And sometimes they are called upon, like James Hansen at the same time of Bill McKibben. He was one of the main scientists who alerted us to the climate crisis in a very modern sense in the 1980s, but he's just not very good at communicating. He himself would admit that, and he had difficulties because of it, but that's a story for another class. So something she does, which is interesting, and it goes to that original quote. In other words, you won't want to see the destruction of nature if you care about nature. So we had the Romantic poets like Wordsworth and Shelley romanticizing, there with a big R, the Romantic movement. Carson also romanticizes the environment. And she also sees it as an object of study. And that's kind of interesting. So she doesn't, as I note here, just romanticize the environment. She does. And she, over the top, describes it in beautiful, poetic ways at times. But also, she tries to come across like a cool, detached scientist. And Thoreau, at the end of his life, he does a lot of that too. We didn't read it, but after Walden, in the late 1850s especially, he sort of does naturalistic writing, which is like that. But if you think about it, it's kind of a razor's edge that she's on here, because on the one hand, if she wants you to take this seriously, because we're talking about science and chemicals and all, then she has to be kind of, like an objective, cool, detached scientist. On the other hand, she doesn't want this to read like it was written by a detached scientist. She wants you actually be, attached to the issue, caring and concerned, and she romanticizes it too. So it's a tough act to do, and as I'll say, I think in the next slide even, she gets criticized for it. Why? Because she comes across a little too emotional at times for some people. And again, they will blame this on the fact that she is, female identified. So, I'm going to show you two images here in a minute. She has this dual image then. One is as a scientist, and the other is as a naturalist. And what do I mean by that? You can see it with these two images here. So this is Rachel Carson, the scientist, looking in a microscope, studying something, presumably something about DDT or insects. And this is Rachel Carson as naturalist out, in the middle of, I don't know where, studying and appreciating nature. The fact is, neither of these are a very accurate depiction of Rachel Carson. They were probably just put out by her publicist, probably with her, approval. But one, she doesn't what she does doesn't involve looking through a microscope or doing anything in the lab at all. What she does, and it doesn't involve going out into a site and looking here for like bird populations or something, whatever she's supposed to be doing. If there were an accurate photo, we'd have a third one, which I look and there aren't any there, which would be Rachel Carson sitting at a desk with a bunch of papers lined up all around her and a typewriter. That's what Rachel Carson did. Her analysis came from, not studying in a lab, but studying the work of people who worked in labs and the impact it had on the natural world. You're going to see, and why she's so important, because she gets it kind of right here. People like Al Gore and Bill McKibben and many, many other environmentalists have followed this formula. So they sort of tug at the heartstrings to get us to care, and then simultaneously and carefully laying out the scientific arguments and making them understandable. She gets attacked for this, again, because she's too emotional. You can't, and people would say, you can't take her as being credible because she's just too caught up in emotion. So the obvious emotion and enthusiasm she has may be coloring it, right? So if you had an actual scientist there, they wouldn't get into that, she argued. But that's what her detractors said, but it worked, and it worked well. It got people to read it, it got people to care. And again, it's that opening quote, she wants you to care about the environment. Why? So that you will not get on board for its, unnecessary destruction. Al Gore, Bill McKibben, and you could name dozens of others that followed in this model. So looking at Bill McKibben, that book I mentioned, the first one to introduce the climate crisis to the American public in 1988, The End of Nature, that starts off with an anecdote. It talks about him in his office and hearing a chainsaw and there's destruction going on out there and all. It's not meant to be all science. It's meant to be anecdotal and interesting and reveal that the person can care about the problem and still be credible. She's very scientific, and there's nothing that's inaccurate that she does, but she does avoid jargon. And she converts things out of jargon to make them interesting and jargon-free. And that's key to her approach because, if it were filled with graphs and arguments, and you can see something like An Inconvenient Truth, it's just not going to be effective. People don't want to see, in fact, there are a few formulas here, but they're very few. There's actually an anecdote about Stephen Hawkins, you may know, is a scientist, cosmologist responsible for what we know about black holes and all. And he wrote a very popular book in the 1970s, and his editor turned it back to him and said, for every time you put a formula in the book, you're going to lose half your audience. So if you have, million people, one formula, you'll have 500,000, another formula, you'll have 250. And Rachel Carson knew that too, that if she put a lot of that in, people would just see it as, confusing because most people aren't familiar with it. So she explains things. And again, why she's so interesting to us like in an English class is because she is really a master of narrative and explanation. Yep. And Carson, Gore, Bill McKibben, they make clear that this enormous power of language to frame and shape an idea. And certainly Johnson knew that. And Thoreau is probably, is our most recent example and probably the best example we've had in this class, because what he does, and this is the sort of growing out of loco-descriptive language, he controls your experience of Walden Pond and his experience there. It's totally controlled, not by painting it or photographing it or anything like that, by the language he uses, the way he uses it, the way he carries you through and the story he writes. And it's the case that Gore and Carson and Bill McKibben take this message and really get it right in a way that Thoreau didn't. Why I say that Thoreau didn't, because no one read Thoreau at the time, or very few people did. Sure, they did a century later, but Carson and Gore are very good at reading, the American public and what the public can hear, is ready to hear, and how to explain it to the public. And that's what makes her so great, because the fact of the matter is, Silent Spring is published in 1962, milestone event, changes everything, creates the modern environmental movement. But guess what? Everything that's said there, for the most part anyhow, was discovered in the previous decade. All this was there. It was sitting in the archives. It was all in obscure libraries. It was all this work done by scientists and in labs everywhere. And they were trying to communicate it to the public, but none of them were able to do it. It took Rachel Carson as a communicator to put it all together, to throw out the jargon, to make it interesting and readable. And boy, she does a phenomenal job of it. So we'll continue with more examples of her considerable rhetorical skill, but not until we have our second poll, second exam question. The narrator of Walden attributes his vegetarian diet to what? Lessons from his parents, his admiration for his mentor, Ralph Waldo Emerson, his natural instincts, his friend John Stuart Mill, or none of those things. So people aren't sure, you're slow to answer. And a few more. Okay. So C is the winner and the correct answer. And so many people knew that, and now they're just, putting it in. So that was mentioned in lecture again. So one of the reasons I gave you these two lecture examples is do look over the PDFs or the Prezi material. So, and if you remember, and I talked about this at length in lecture, Thoreau says, he thinks that this is a natural thing to not want to eat animals, and it's only that we've learned this over time. If you go back over the PDF, you'll see I say that explicitly, and if you go back over the transcript of what I said, you'll see that I talked a good bit about that. Okay. So more on Carson as communicator and giving some examples here. So I hear murmuring. Sure, people are just clearing their throats. So the best example may be, boy, this is like a perfect final exam question, the title. The title, Silent Spring, what's that refer to? It's actually taken from a poem by John Keats that describes a devastated environment where, quote, the sedge is withered from the lake and no birds sing. Why is it a silent spring? Because there are no birds singing. Springtime, especially if you're a place that has really distinct seasons, where we kind of don't in Santa Barbara, but I'm from back east, and it's been snowing and it's cold and it's winter and the spring gets here. And more than anything else, if you even went out and closed your eyes, you would know it's spring because you hear bird song. Birds are everywhere. Birds are now hatching their young, and there's just birds everywhere. Rachel Carson says something's wrong because now we have a silent spring. And I'll go over in detail, but just as, spoiler, why is that the case? Because DDT is killing birds. DDT is this, we've been told it's a pesticide. We were told by the chemical companies making it that it only killed insects. We sprayed it to get rid of mosquitoes, a real pest that spread disease. It all sounded good. But hey, it turns out no one had studied what was happening to other animals because of it. And one of the big problems that affected all sorts of birds was that DDT, it's complicated, but basically what it does, it made the shells of the eggs of birds thinner. So thin that the bird, in some cases, they weren't even hatched because they weren't even, the bird wasn't even able to lay them because in the process, they would actually break. Or, as you know, the mother bird sits on top of the eggs to warm them and all, but the shells were so thin that the eggs were being broken by that. So here you have what should have been, birds being born, and this one chemical introduced into their bodies by way of pesticides. And why is that the case? Well, because as you know, many birds eat insects. So yes, mosquitoes were killed by DDT, but then when the birds ate the DDT, they ingested DDT and it caused that problem. So they weren't able to procreate adequately or in anywhere near the same numbers. So Carson says, we are now facing a silent spring. She's also really great, and here I called this a sort of a razor's edge before. Here's how she deals with it in a way. When she wants to express a very emotional point of view, then she wants to communicate that to you. She often doesn't put it in her own words. She talks about, quote, a housewife who wrote her a letter saying, "It's hard to explain to the children that the birds have all been killed off. Is there anything being done? Can anything being done? Can I do anything?" This is classic Rachel Carson and brilliant Rachel Carson. Why? Because one, she doesn't take that position herself. She puts it in the mouth of this, quote, housewife, who, I don't know whether this person actually existed or not, but it doesn't really matter, because the real rhetorical force here is, we're not talking about a housewife somewhere here. We're talking about the reader. So this occurs, I think it's actually on page like 101 of the regular text. And this should not be, to Rachel Carson thinking, this is not her perspective. This is not this possibly imaginary housewife. This should be what happens in the reader. By the time you get to page 100, if you've read this book, if you've been following it, you should then say, "Oh, it's really hard. How am I supposed to explain this to children that the birds have been killed off? Hey, Rachel Carson, is there anything being done? Can anything be done? What can I do?" If Rachel Carson has succeeded at what she wants to do, the reader will be that, quote, housewife. The reader will be that angry, indignant, concerned person who gets to that last, working through those things in that quote, gets to the last one there. Can I do anything? That's the end game. She has mobilized her reader there. She has her reader not only aware of the problem, but mortified by the problem and wanting to do something to help. That's an amazing accomplishment to have done. And she actually puts the reader's response into the text, so that when you read that, yeah, of course, that's going to totally resonate with you. That's how you feel. And if she's done her job well, and she does her job well, then that's how you will feel too. She's also very careful about buying into other people's terms. And the obvious one here is that these chemicals like DDT should not be called insecticides. So what happens? The industry producing it says, we can kill mosquitoes and other insects. We have an insecticide. It just kills insects by the name. Says insecticide, and it's like, patricide. Who is it killing? Not a father, but insects. Rachel Carson says, yeah, but it's killing birds. It's killing all sorts of animals at the same time. I don't want to call it insecticide. That is an absolutely misleading statement. We need to call it a biocide. It kills life, period. It kills plants, it kills animals, it kills birds, it kills all sorts of things, including, she would argue, human beings at the end of the cycle. So it's clever because she just, most people would just buy into the way it's described. Carson, understanding it, realizes she's already in a rhetorical battle, that the rhetorical battle has started, that somewhere in a lab, or somewhere in a chemical company who had this chemical, they thought, how do we market this to people? We can't call it the killing spray. No one's going to want to buy that. So they make it sound like it's like a very fine, like guided missile or drone that focuses on one thing, when it does nothing of the sort. She actually, and this is where it's so effective, she does her research. She studies the history of where DDT and these, quote, insecticides came from. And she notes, and this is the quote here, in the course of developing agents of chemical warfare. So during the Second World War, they were trying to develop chemical warfare to use against human beings. The United States was funding chemical companies to try to get agents that you could spray and kill people, not unlike the gas was used during the First World War and all. It wasn't used, but that's what it was being developed for. Some of the chemicals developed in the laboratory were found to be lethal to insects. How did they find that out? The discovery did not come by chance. Insects were widely used to test chemicals as agents of death for man, or human beings. So what this was meant to be a chemical to kill people, to be used during the war. So the war ends. Now, what are they going to do? They've been developing all these chemicals. They have a particularly good one here, DDT, that's good at killing. Someone remembers that in addition to using it, so you think at least, I'm not a scientist. I always think in labs they test things on like white mice or something. I'm sure they did, but as Carson notes, they also were using insects here to test these because it was even easier to do. And someone remembered, well, we've developed this thing and we don't need to kill people anymore, but remember how good that was at killing insects? Why don't we market it for that? Why don't we not call it a chemical weapon? Why don't we call it an insecticide and kill just insects? And once you read that, you realize, well, this is what's happened here. This is like egregious that this chemical weapons are now being sprayed everywhere. And I'll show you in a little bit. They were being sprayed everywhere. Then Carson makes another one of her great quotes here. As the habit of killing grows, the resort to eradicating any creature that may annoy or inconvenience us grows with it. So, the habit of killing. Why do we want to kill insects? Well, we want to kill mosquitoes. Mosquitoes spread disease. They spread malaria. They spread all sorts of things. Nowadays, they spread Zika virus and all. Okay, so we do that. But then Carson says, we're in the habit of killing now. Any creature that may annoy us or inconvenience us. Hey, flies are an example. Flies don't spread malaria, but they're darn annoying, right? Go to a picnic or something, all those flies around. Why can't we just kill them too? Carson calls that the habit of killing. Once you kill once, then killing becomes easier. It's like a day-to-day thing. We think nothing of it. And she sees this as like, morally, spiritually acting on us to accept the idea that we can just kill anything that we want. And great question she asks, who has made the decision that sets into motion these chains of poisoning, this ever-widening wave of death that spreads out like ripples when a pebble is dropped into a still pond? So first, the image here, these chains of poisoning. So it's right. I mean, it's not just spraying an insecticide. You're intentionally poisoning another being. You're killing another being. Who has done that? This ever-widening wave of death that started in the center with maybe, mosquitoes and now moves to flies and now moves to poisoning other things like, mice and rats and all. Who has made the decision that sets this into motion? And that's really the central question of this quote, because Rachel Carson didn't make it. This was made by a chemical company and politicians to do this. And communities weren't necessarily involved in the decisions back then. It was just done. And what I mean by that, it wasn't put to a vote in the community. It wasn't like it was a discussion at the local, board of a town or something. She wants to know who's done that. And the answer is, well, it's the chemical company. And the chemical companies have done it because they're trying to sell it, and then they have to get politicians on board to enact it. But as Rachel Carson says, she hasn't made this decision. Parents haven't made this decision. This was made by another group of people. This should kind of echo the early interpretation that Lynn White Jr. and others offered of Genesis, the idea that human beings have dominion over the world. As man proceeds towards his announced goal, the conquest of nature or having dominion over nature, he has written a depressing record of destruction directed not only against the earth he inhabits, but against the life that shares it with him. So, the remarkable statement here. People again had this sort of naive faith in science and all. She says, but this is the project. The project here is the conquest of nature, to have full dominion over nature. And what is that but a depressing record of destruction? It's not only against the earth, it's not only strip mining and deforestation and all that, but against the life on the planet that shares it with us. And starting with insects, but again, the ever widening, destruction going from, mosquitoes to flies to rats to whatever. This is our goal now, and we're actually succeeding at it on a global level. And this, was only a theoretical problem before, but now Rachel Carson says we're actually doing it. We have conquered the planet, but what did that involve? she also appeals, and you'll see other environmentalists doing this too. Even if you don't care about nature, even if you don't buy into that opening quote today, you have to care about nature to want to save it. Maybe you only care about yourself, and you say, I don't really care about flies and rats and all. I don't like them anyhow. But if that's your attitude, she addresses it here to you. The fact that every meal that you eat carries its load of chlorinated hydrocarbons is the inevitable consequence, is the universal spraying or dusting of agricultural crops with these poisons. So maybe you don't care about the birds eating it and all, but think about it. This is being sprayed on the crops that you eat. So we know that birds are ingesting it and it's causing them problems. Maybe you don't care about the birds, but what about you? You are taking this into your body. This thing that was developed as a chemical weapon against human beings, you are now eating it, and you didn't make this decision for this to happen. This was a decision made elsewhere, motivated by these chemical companies. So it's a great quote and a great multi-pronged approach to her rhetoric here. So maybe to get you thinking like a parent, how do I tell this to my children? That one quote maybe get you thinking like an environmentalist. I really care about the planet and other species. Maybe getting you thinking, hitting you if you just think like a selfish person, thinking that maybe this could impact you too. Our line of defense against invading poisons or poisons from within is now weakened or crumbling. Again, powerful rhetoric. Our line of defense, there's a war going on here, and we should be fighting against the invading poisons or poisons from within that we're ingesting. But we're not. The line of defense is now weakened and crumbling. And that's really an appeal to strengthen the line of defense. And I would argue 10 years after this, the EPA will be formed in the United States with the expressed goal of doing just that, of protecting the environment, making it safe for animals and for us. And that's the line of defense that we have today. Because, no one can just start spraying chemicals, even on their own property. It's the way this works. So if you decide you have some chemical and you want to start doing it, you can only purchase chemicals in a certain way. And if you do use them indiscriminately, there'll be massive fines for you. Even something like if you decide to spread oil or gasoline on your own property, you'll get massive fines for that. That's what the EPA does. It protects the environment, it protects the animals, protects us, which is all the more remarkable. Just as an aside, you might remember in the 2016 presidential election, or maybe you don't remember, that one of Donald Trump's campaign promises was to do away with the EPA. Because the EPA, according to Trump, got in the way of business and it was a problem. And what we really needed was to get away and let business operate the way it wanted to. And of course, Rachel Carson's whole mission was to not let business operate the way it wanted to. So continuing with this. One of the things that she really put on the map that you mentioned before when we did Gilgamesh, you encounter it every day, is this notion of natural, right? So we saw way back in the myth of the Gilgamesh, there was that dyad between the natural and unnatural. Everything inside the city was natural, outside the wall was unnatural. At that time, the unnatural was, the not preferred thing. But even as early as Theocritus, when we have pastoral, then we start preferring the natural. The notion that human beings have messed things up, but we should want to prefer what's natural and unmessed by human beings. That attitude was alive and well in the West for hundreds of years before Carson. What Carson does is to use it really effectively, saying that you should like the natural. We all know we like the natural. We all love pastoral. We all wish we could be out in the perfect, countryside where everything is nice and untouched by human beings. We love to go to places like Yosemite and all. And guess what? What's the thing that is dangerous here is the unnatural. Yes, it's like when we do deforestation or when we build cities and all, but she says these chemicals, they are like the icons of the unnatural. They do not exist in nature. They are created in labs. DDT is not something that was, discovered the way something like aspirin would have been discovered and then marketed. It was created in the labs, like polyester or nylon or any of these other polymers. That's not a polymer, but that are created in labs. That's what it is. And to her, that's you can't get more unnatural than that. And we've had all this pastoral literature telling us that we don't like the unnatural. We like the natural. We always had set our gaze on the natural, and that's what we should focus on. And of course, I say that you know this because walk into any store, buy any product, you want the most natural product. You want, if ideally, to have something that's guaranteed to be natural. And the only way you can get a guarantee to be natural in the US that means anything, if you're buying food, is to buy organic. Why? Because there's a government organization that tests that food to guarantee that you're getting it organic. You don't rely on the farmers producing it. You don't rely on the agribusiness producing it. You rely on the government to give you an assurance that it's natural. Problem in Carson's period, there was nothing. There was no organization doing that. And she fears this unnaturalness of it all. So she inherits, right? We've seen this from Gilgamesh on, this dyad, this binary structure between natural and unnatural. Other people talk about this. In some sense, it's in pastoral. We see it with Thoreau. Thoreau preferred the natural, but Carson is just very effective at communicating this. So much so, and I don't think it backfired, but it is interesting because many people took her argument and thought that, well, maybe everything was natural 100 years ago or 50 years before Carson was writing. But as we've seen in this class, it's not. We've done massive modification to this planet. The West has, that's followed, with deforestation, out of the Middle Eastern portion of the world into everywhere now. So it's not like it was natural before, but Carson, especially, we'll talk about it in a minute, in the opening of Silent Spring, she wants to give the impression that everything was pretty much perfect and natural a generation or two ago. And that should sound a lot like pastoral, because what she's doing is actually employing pastoral, and we'll see that shortly. One thing that this text does that hadn't happened before in the same way was shift environmental interest toward toxicity. So remember, people are anxious about deforestation. That's one thing, been around 5,000 or more years. Anxious about increased urbanization, certainly get that in Virgil and his era. Anxious about things like burning fossil fuels. We certainly saw that in Shakespeare's era. But this is something new. The idea that people were actually fabricating poisons that did not exist before and unleashing them on the planet, where they were being ingested by all sorts of creatures, including human beings. That notion is big. And that's still, by the way, alive and well today. So if you're, concerned about things like microplastic and all, plastics of that sort don't exist in nature. They were created, they're put out in the environment. And as you may know, microplastics have now been found everywhere. People have gone to like the tallest, part of the planet, Mount Everest or K2, and in the snow they found microplastics. You find microplastics and fish that live deep in the oceans and all. And Carson very much wants to make us aware of what we are doing. That it's not just that we're creating this, but it's not in the lab. Once we figure out how to make it, we're disseminating it everywhere. And that's new that we're doing it. And Rachel Carson alerts us to it. And then all sorts of people after, rightly, draw attention to how this is done in other industries. But an interesting thing here, and this is, it's good and bad. I would say mostly good, but good and bad, is she keeps her focus tightly on a particular problem. She doesn't, as I note here, like Al Gore, overwhelm her audience with the frightening range of environmental problems. They focus on a particular problem, which they carefully explore in detail. So Carson knew that there were a ton of environmental problems in her era. So she focuses on pesticides, but even then, just on a particular pesticide, a single chemical, DDT. She doesn't focus on fossil fuel derived fertilizers. She doesn't focus on herbicides, which are designed to kill weeds. She doesn't focus on, as I suggested, other chemicals being introduced into the atmosphere or into water systems. Like, a paint factory will be releasing new chemicals, like latex paint is not a natural thing. It's a colloidal solid. It's something that's made up. But that was all happening, and she knew that was all happening. But instead, she ignores it all and focuses on one particular issue. And you might say, well, why does she do that? I mean, why didn't she just write everything's a problem? I would argue there's a very clever rhetorical strategy here that worked, and as a consequence, you have to applaud it. And that is, she wanted to prove to us that we could tackle one of these problems and resolve it. And we did. Within 10 years of this book, DDT is banned in the United States. And that's a huge victory for the environmental movement. It proved that people could get together. It proved that a government organization could be formed. It proved that it could have enough power to do it. It proved that the chemical company wasn't in charge. It was a great case study in what could be done. If she had focused on everything, first, it would have been overwhelming. And that's the way a lot of people, I think, feel about the climate crisis now. When you read about it, you realize the enormity of it. You just want to put the book down and cry. But Rachel Carson instead empowered us to actually want to do something. Al Gore and others, Bill McKibben would be a good example, are principally focusing on a single problem, which is the climate crisis. And I think many people probably you might think, well, that's the big environmental problem. That's the existential problem of this generation, maybe the biggest existential problem the human race has ever faced. That may be true. But there are a ton of other things still here. We still have to worry about pesticides, which are biocides. We still have to worry about all sorts of chemical industries, putting things in the atmosphere. We have to worry about, things like point source pollution that maybe in the United States, because of the EPA, is not that bad. But in other countries where they don't have the same sort of, very stringent environmental protections, it is a problem. So you may know, if you wear blue jeans, you often don't get that really deep blue jean. We often get like stonewashed blue jeans. There's a river in China called the Emerald River that actually now flows blue because we are not using a natural indigo, which is a dye derived from a plant, the indigo plant, but we now have synthesized it, made a chemical. We dye this deep, rich color into blue jeans, and then they get washed in factories, and without the right environmental safeguards, that chemical gets dumped out into the river. And in this case, the river is literally blue now. That is a huge environmental problem. Someone should write a book about that. In fact, there is a documentary about that called River Blue, if I'm remembering correctly. But Carson and Al Gore, they want to get one problem and they want to solve this one problem. And that's great. And again, Carson succeeded and let us know that we can succeed. But on the other hand, it can be a little misleading because we might just think that the climate crisis is our only environmental problem today. Unfortunately, it's not. Neither of them write about pollution in general then. They don't talk about industrial runoff into rivers, into aquifers, the release of chemicals such as sulfur dioxide, which is what we saw from burning coal during Shakespeare's period, and the byproduct acid rain, solid waste pollution at landfills, pollution of our oceans. And that's just pollution. They also don't talk about other types of environmental devastation. So, for example, you may know, California is in the process of desertification. It is being converted into a desert. Why is that the case? Because we are using far too much water. We have industries, agricultural industries in California that are literally drying up aquifers. And it cannot happen for even a few more decades before it gets converted to a desert. The irony is, you might think that, kind of going to go on a little aside here for a moment, that like if you live in California, the biggest thing you can do is watch what you do in your house, right? Take shorter showers, that sort of thing. 4% of the water used in California is done residentially inside of houses. 80% is used for agriculture. And the problem with that is 60% is used either for the creation of animal products like beef and milk, that's 46%. The other 14% are for tree nuts like almonds, which create almond milk. That's 60% of the water in this state. If you could eliminate those industries, we would have so much water in this state, we would be able to live sustainably in this state. We wouldn't be converting it into a desert. But that is what's happening now with all sorts of industries that just can't work at a sustainable level. And that's just one example of so many things that we're doing that's not sustainable. So the problem is, even as I tell you this, you're probably like, oh my gosh, this is just so much to hear. And I think that's the case. And that's why Carson focuses on that one problem. And the hope will be people will come after her, focusing on all sorts of problems, including California being made into a desert, which is happening now. So there are plenty of activists focusing on that, and you can learn about that and even do something about it if you wanted to. Yep. So it's done it at great cost here, which is exploring other environmental problems. That's the thing. So, and I'm not being critical of Carson. I'm not. I mean, I think what she did was brilliant. It was effective. It changed the world. And I think in retrospect, I wouldn't say, and we historically know now it wasn't the right thing to do. I think it absolutely was the right thing to do. But you just have to realize if your environmental awareness is coming out of that book rather than the general situation, you should know that there was a lot more on the horizon. Okay, so let's do this one. Kind of curious about this. Do you read generally books or articles on the environment or the climate crisis? So have you read a lot for other classes? Do you read it on your own? Have you read a little bit for another class? Do you occasionally read on your own, or is it rarely the case? And I really don't know what you're going to say. So I am curious about this. And by the way, I don't mean to virtue signal to anyone or to shame you if you don't, because part of the thing I was just talking about, it is absolutely overwhelming, and it is a natural. It is naturally the case that people do shut down over this issue, and climate anxiety is a huge thing, which is why it's one of the first things we take up in English 23 and 24. Anyhow, so most occasionally read it, but that would be it. And what's really interesting here, you haven't read it for other classes. There's no GE requirement for the environment or climate at UCSB or in any of the UCs, let alone the UC system. And I think that's a problem. I think this is an opportunity for you to read more about it, and it should be incorporated more into classes. And we're working on that, by the way, but yeah. Okay, let's jump into our last slide. So we will get out of here a little early, I think. Both Carson and Gore make use of this pastoral notion, which we've encountered again and again, of the perfect locus hominis, that amiable, wonderful locale. Whether or not they believed in it, who knows? But both Carson and Gore exploit the fact that we do. That we believe that there was a time when people had a pretty good relationship with the planet and life was wonderful. That comes out of pastoral literature. It's historically not so clear that there was ever a time like that. And they both argue, by the way, since they assume that you believe it because you've had thousands of years of pastoral influencing our culture that you were born into. If they assume you believe it, then they have a promise for you. And that is, if you tackle these problems, we can again make the earth a paradise which is now lost. So, explain this further. This is the literal opening. These are the opening sentences of Silent Spring. There was once a town in the heart of rural America where all life seemed to live at harmony with its surroundings. Even in winter, the roadsides were places of beauty where countless birds came to feed. So you've now read a good bit of pastoral. You should identify that as pastoral, right? And rural America, we're away from the city, we're out into a place where everything seemed to be at harmony. All life is at harmony with its surroundings. And this is almost like, and I don't know if Carson is actually referencing Shakespeare's As You Like It, but remember the Duke says, the only problem with England is that it gets cold, but I still like the cold. And she says here, even the roadsides, winter, the roadsides were places of beauty. So even what you would think would not be pastoral would be like the winter time where there's snow and all. Even then, countless birds came to feed. So the US, pastoral, rural America used to be wonderful and perfect. Then a strange blight crept over the area and everything began to change. Everywhere was a shadow of death. On the mornings that had once throbbed with the dawn chorus of robins, catbirds, doves, jays, wrens, and scores of other bird voices, there was now no sound, only silence, only a silent spring. So it's pastoral that's been destroyed. It's the story of Eden all over again, right? Something happened, something crept in. Eden was once perfect like that. What destroyed it? In the Judeo-Christian tradition, human sin. Humans came and destroyed that perfect relationship. Now everything is devoted to death. Everything is dead and bad. And there's no longer this dawn chorus of all these various birds and all. So then it read like pastoral, then it's sort of the end of pastoral. It's just like, you know, the story of Eden or Hesiod, where we go from the golden age to the current, you know, iron age, where everything is so bad. And then at this point, if you've gotten this far, it should raise a question, and you should be reading this kind of like a whodunit. So, okay, if this is true, if this is what happened, who did it? Who destroyed this? Who brought all this there? If you could read Genesis the same way, and you know who did it, human beings did it. And guess what? It's the same answer here. It's the same, structurally the same story. Al Gore, if you watch An Inconvenient Truth, and I recommend it. I can actually put it on GauchoCast if people want to look at it. He starts off with this beautiful scene of this wilderness stream. It's unspoiled, it's uncorrupted by human beings, and he won't even, or the producers of the film won't even let a human creep into the scene. So remember all those artwork we saw where the human presence gets shrinking and shrinking and shrinking? Well, there is no presence. It's just this beautiful stream. And all you hear is Al Gore's wonderful voice over it saying, this used to be the way the planet was. Something horrible has happened. What is it? And again, you're in a whodunit. What is it? Same story. Eden was lost because of the sin of human beings, not bringing about, you know, chemical spraying of DDT, but to Al Gore doing everything that we've done to bring about the change in our climate. So remember Ed Burtynsky, the guy who does those amazing large-scale photographs of sites of environmental devastation, like in Bangladesh and Indonesia and elsewhere. Carson and Gore like that. So they're doing more than anything else an anti-pastoral. They're not looking at where everything is great. And I know Carson does that in those opening sentences, but the rest of the book is going to look at all the problems, all the devastation, and focus on it. And they have a reason, because they want to turn the clock back to before the devastation. And if they mobilize you, if you're finally there, like that quote housewife in the quote before, who says, you know, is anything being done? Can anything being done? What can I do? If they get you there to be, what can I do? Then maybe you will roll up your sleeves and change. So they're different from Thoreau. And I think one of the problems with Thoreau is, is if you seek out wilderness, if you find some place where you can go that's wilderness-like, and Thoreau tries that, he gets as close as he can without walking too far from home. But you're ignoring environmental devastation. You're not focusing on the problems. And there were a ton of problems in Thoreau's era, but he doesn't focus on them because he just wants to imagine a perfect pastoral life and tell you how wonderful it is. Carson and Gore say that's not enough. We need to firmly look at the problem. So Carson has those opening sentences, but then she firmly looks at the problem in great detail. And this is a different type of environmentalism, right? So that first type of environmentalism that starts in the 1850s, that's more about fetishizing wilderness, seeing it as beautiful and perfect. This environmentalism, what is truly modern environmentalism that gave birth to the modern environmental movement, is about focusing on the problems that we have done, and more than just looking at them, trying to solve them. It's a whole new wave of eco-critics too. These people sort of, the first wave was so interested in Henry David Thoreau. So back when I was in graduate school 20 years ago, people focused on Thoreau and said how wonderful Thoreau was. But then we realized, of course, that there's a problem, that these folks are overly romanticizing wilderness. We buy into it. We're also ignoring what they want us to ignore, which are the problems themselves. And Silent Spring does a great job of doing that. Okay, so there we are. I'll get this posted today. Please study over the weekend for the final exam. One more lecture on Tuesday.